I think we are going to let a couple of attendees ask their own questions. Or David C. And there you are. Hi, David.
Hello, hello, hello. I just wanted to share a little bit about what's been going on in the UK. The British East Asian art sector is obviously much smaller in the UK compared to the States, but we are pushing back as best we can. There is a grassroots organization called CARG, which stands for COVID-19 Anti-Racism Group. I posted the website in the chat room. It's carg.info, and that is doing all it can, talking with the media, with broadcasters, with politicians, to try and push back. So I myself, I'm an actor, writer, director, but I'm at the moment, the story that I'm most preoccupied is kind of political and social discourse. And that's the main story I'm currently invested in. I'm putting my energies into CARG because unless we do it, nobody else is speaking up on our behalf. In the UK, there's been a threefold increase in terms of hate crime. I mean, I read the news, I see things are far more violent in the States with, acid attacks and stabbings and so on. Here it's more punch-ups and beating up of people. But as I say, it's unprecedented, this kind of tsunami of hate that the UN chief talked about. And so currently CARG is doing all it can, talking on a weekly basis with the Metropolitan Police, listening to their advice about how to advise members of our community to report hate crime. The Met Police have been brilliant because they've done multiple different language versions for the older community. Obviously for younger people, we all speak English, but for older members of the Chinese community, whether Mandarin or Cantonese speaking, or Japanese or Vietnamese, and they've done a whole range of different language videos teaching people how to report hate crime. So that's been incredibly important. In terms of creativity, there's a petition called Let's Get More British Chinese / East Asians on TV, film, theatre and radio. Again, I've posted a link to that petition. And I started that petition 10 years ago. We've only just reached over 1,000 people. So that's how slow things are in the UK. But finally, we've got over that milestone. And I'm wanting now to combine that petition with the CARG work and trying to assemble a small committee of high profile people like yourselves, but the UK equivalents, to lobby the broadcasters who are the gatekeepers. Because at the moment, whereas American equity is very strong, so that you have all these quota systems, so that you very regularly see Asian American faces on your screens. In the UK, we are almost invisible. Okay, British equity does not have teeth like American equity does. So over here, we need to lobby, and this is the new group that I'm trying to put together at the moment. A few high-profile individuals from different areas of expertise, some in the media, some in terms of entertainment world and the arts, creative world. A small committee who will then lobby people like Tony Hall, who is the Director General of the BBC, Alex Mahon, who's the Chief Executive of Channel 4, all the kind of top gatekeepers, because we need them to say to the people who work beneath them that they actually need to create a British Chinese family or a British East Asian family on any of those soaps. As soon as that's done, suddenly our lives become normalized. And that the current racism we're facing from COVID-19 will be much less extreme. Racism online at the moment is very extreme because people think of us as foreigners. They don't think of us as British. We don't have enough of a media presence, unlike the States. You know, you've got Lucy, you know, there are famous Constance Wu, etc. You know, Henry Golding, he got his break in the States, not in the UK. Gemma Chan, the same. You know, she's become famous in the States rather than here. Benedict Wong and so on. You know, it's the States that is far more open to diversity than the UK. So here it's still a real struggle for us. So thank you for allowing me to speak. Please sign our petitions to help amplify our voices.
Thank you, David, for that. Did you actually have a question for any of the panelists?
I mean, well, thank you to all of you, because it's very inspiring, very encouraging to hear everything that you've said. I think given that we are working with this scenario, both in the States and in the UK, of white supremacy, and obviously the UK started that as being the chief colonizer, yeah? So the roots of white supremacy in the States is from Europe. It's from particularly the UK, which was the largest colonizer. So given that that is the status quo, you know, how can we in the UK learn from how quickly things changed in the States? In the States, you went from, in 100 years, you went from slavery to having the first Black president. We are nowhere near that, despite the UK's so-called, you know, liberal arts sector, but actually we're nowhere near having a Black prime minister. So how can we learn from you, I suppose? You know, I mean, obviously in the States you have, in terms of demographics, there are far more Asian Americans and people of color have an awareness of working, you know, across their different groups. So, you know, since Black Lives Matter and the civil rights movement, there's much more awareness of different racial groups working, you know, together. Whereas here, it sort of happens with over here, we're not called people of color, we're called BAME, which is Black, Asian, Minority, Ethnic. That's the grouping that we come under in the UK. But actually, very rarely do we work. It's only recently that an open letter has been written to the minister from the Department of Culture, Media and Sport, where all the BAME artistic directors co-wrote an open letter to ensure that funding for our sector is ring-fenced. Because obviously, when we come out of the lockdown, everybody is economically desperate. And a lot of people will be looking after their own, so to speak. And so it's been great that in the UK, the BAME ADs have all co-written this thing, demanding that we're not sidelined, because that can very easily happen, because all the white-led theatres companies will be struggling for funding and for survival themselves. So it's very easy that, you know, they're first in the queue. So, I mean, yes, that my question, basically everything that everybody's said today, very inspiring, and all power to you guys, and keep up the good fight. And it's trying for East Asians in the UK, it's trying to develop closer connections with our Asian American peers and other people of color in order to, I suppose, learn, because you're further ahead. You're far more, even though, you know, terrible things like what happened recently in Minnesota, even though these very dreadful, very violent things still occur unacceptably, in terms of your political discourse and your political voice, people of color are far more advanced than in the UK.
Thank you, David. I don't mean to cut you short, but we have lots of questions.
I've banged on long enough.
Carly says, I would love to hear how each of you believes a system of white supremacy can be successfully dismantled, and where do we each begin on a personal level? What practices, policies, etc., could be put into place to end this systemic racism? Who wants that question? Dee?
Okay, so well, the first thing to do is to speak up and support many of the young men who've been murdered or have been the subjects of police violence. You know, lend a hand, lend a voice there. I mean, we're not just talking about Ahmaud Arbery, but you know, Breonna Taylor. She was shot 8 times by cops who were in her house, and it was the wrong house. You know, there are many ways to challenge and support folks who are on the front lines. I mean, support Black Lives Matter, support the NAACP. As a matter of fact, in one of my resources, this wonderful woman named Michelle Kim broke out 20 ways to support important causes. So Carly, if that's your name, I would refer to that. Because there are so many ways to stand up and be counted and support folks who are on the front lines fighting white supremacy every day. And I try to do my part. I really speak up. I mean, there is no friend who knows me who I don't, you know, have these tough conversations. I mean, I think it's important. We need to have them.
Anyone else have a comment on that? Okay.
Yeah, it's Mel. One thing is like, damn, you have these huge problems, and now I'm going to ask artists and historians and politicians to solve them. You know, first of all, I want to tackle the word change. How do you change something? I don't know. We can take steps to transform things. And the first thing is transformation of our own organizations and our own selves to join with the Black community and the Black Lives Matter and all these entities in true support, because you should join those that are the most inundated by this reality. And so that's one thing. And I think you create conditions to aid in that transformation, and understand it's not actually, maybe if fear is the motivator and divisional characteristics that go along with it, find your place to insert within that and dismantle that, or to disrupt that. Be a disruptor, I say. So it's definitely always on the active side of engagement. How to figure out how to, if not your voice, how to enhance the voice of a whole nother community so that their presence is heard more. You know, use the tools that we have as artists and conceptualists.
Yeah, Inez, you know, just to, I mean, I agree with Mel 100%. The other thing I wanted to mention is that I think it's unfair, and I'm not suggesting anyone on this panel, I think it's unfair to expect Black folks to be the racial, you know, I think that's another example, frankly, of anti-Blackness, where there's an expectation that Black folks, you know, put on this mantle of resistance at all times. I mean, I think white superiority is something that we all should lend a hand in dismantling, and not always rely on Black folks to carry the water, if you will, if that makes sense.
Agree.
I mean, I would just like to add that I think it also requires that, you know, in thinking about the myths, right, to kind of just look at history and look at our trajectory and not to look at it through rose-colored glasses. I know change is hard, and none of these conversations that we're proposing are easy, because it means that you might get into arguments with friends, with people who you might have considered close to you, with family members. But I don't think a fear of what the outcome might be is a good enough reason to not call for the change that needs to happen. So I think that we can walk and chew gum at the same time. I think we can change things as well as build things. And I think that's really, when Mel talks about transformation, a really good word for it, right? And I think that we can do it thoughtfully and we can do it together. But I think also it's really important that we come to terms to this country's and this world's history of violence, and that when we look at who opposes peaceful change, that we know that we're going to come up against some resistance. And how are we going to handle that? You know, and I'm not saying that I have the answer for it, but I guess I'm saying that none of it is easy, but it does take a lot of courage, and courage isn't just a word. It's something that's real if we're gonna make action or take action.
Question from Miguel Payano is on your share screen, I hope. Can you guys see that?
Question for Teresa. How do we go about changing history books, specifically those used in public schools? What can the average person do to support this?
Yeah, I started typing out the answer to this question. I think it's really important for folks to get involved in their local schools or school boards. I think the opportunities vary depending on where you are. But for example, here in Chicago, all the public schools have local school councils that anyone can run for. There are positions for parents and also community representatives. And, that's a really good way to interact with, school leaders and ask these questions about, what kinds of history books are being used, what topics and things like that. I think that getting involved in the library, local library boards, that could be another, way to address this. School systems sometimes adopt certain textbooks, kind of that the entire school system uses. And unfortunately, I think there's a movement in, some places where that's become a hotly politicized topic. And so, having an awareness of, what textbooks, what kinds of approaches they take to history, I think that, that's worth looking into. And there might be efforts, in your state legislature to, call for adding certain topics to the curriculum. That's another approach. There's lots of different ways. I wouldn't say there's really one way to do it. The way that I initially, at the beginning of my career, thought that, I could change this topic was by getting a PhD. I don't really recommend that to a lot of people, but, I was really inspired knowing my own family history, and that my grandfather had come to the United States as a paper son, during the time when it was not permitted for Chinese immigrants to come. And, so he lived here, having come in using false documents, and lived and worked in the United States, and contributed to the building of this country, to the economy. And I think that, I was really inspired by his story, and, knew that there were a lot of other people with stories like that who, contributed to the economy of this country and to build this country, but, didn't get their stories told in mainstream history. And so, I wanted to help, shape those stories, write those histories and teach it as a college professor. And so that's what I did for the first part of my career. I think that there's still a lot of work to do, right? Because, you know, despite, you know, our understanding that immigrants built this country, immigrants and enslaved people built this country, there's no acknowledgement, or there's not sufficient acknowledgement of that in our history books.
Thank you. Thank you. And our next question is from Guangyu. Can we transform international alliance with the power to question countries and ask countries to work collaboratively? How do we address the economical system that's not entangled in racism? Either systems cannot be changed without changing the other. Who wants that one? It's a tough one.
Questions. These are big ass questions, I'm telling you. You know, I just want to, I see there's so much frustration, and the question like that to me emerges from just acknowledgement that things are just horrible, you know? And maybe I was moving on too much, you know. It's not like, well, let me put it this way. Maybe it's really difficult to stand forward. We talk about courage and all that, but not everybody's courageous enough at this time. But maybe to think about it on a creative level is to rethink even this term of action in terms of being a catalytic structure, to think about what part can you play to tackle these questions and put things into motion, like to support the coming of a question or the coming of an action, instead of expecting, having an expectation that may never be met because it's too large of a deal to deal with. You know what I'm saying? So anyway, I think you do have to change yourself, and maybe also step back and see what you have in your capacity and where you can step up as a person, as an individual, to work collectively. It may be too high of a goal. Anyway, I don't think that answers the question, but maybe I think the question actually exposes how frustrating it is on an international level.
One of the things that I think a lot about is imagination as a radical act of freedom. You know, and I think that, you know, it's really hard to be at peace with oneself, right? And so the question is monumental, right? But I think that in so considering, right, how that might happen, one really has to go inward and also build out with their communities, and also just consider who can be allies, where they can get information, and really try and utilize their networks as best they can. I think the more informed we can be, and the more in community we can be with others and within ourselves, is a good place to start. But I think it does have to kind of start in our own minds and our own hearts. And so, yes, I don't think that answers the larger international question, right? But I do think that, you know, I do think that we all have a lot more, we have family in other countries. We have the ability to communicate with each other. We've solved for bigger problems, but usually solving for these bigger problems has had to start with acknowledging that there is a problem and there is a need to solve for it. So I think that's a really good place to start if we can.
Thank you. Our next question is by Holly. US is further ahead for Black president, which is brilliant, but no female presidents, whereas UK has had female PMs. And yes, POC represented better in films in US than UK, but seems like day-to-day racism is worse in UK. I mean, in US. Thoughts? Anybody have thoughts on that? Most of us are North American based. I'm not sure. Phil, or
well, I think one of the things, if you think about in the United Kingdom, which is different than us, is in the United States, we like to have this idea that if you come here, you become American. we'd like to think that we don't have one central way of looking at things, but that we ideally would be open to lots of different people's experiences. So that's kind of what goes along with American democracy, is like this idea that we're all here, we all get a voice, and every voice matters. In the UK, there's I feel like it's much more like an old world way of thinking, where there is a British identity, there is a degree of conformity and assimilation required by immigrants to be British, in the same way that there might not be as Americans. So if you're here, you're American, you don't even have to speak English. You can live in an exclusively Chinese community, like many of my aunts and uncles, and not even participate with white American life in that way, even though you might be affected by it. Whereas in the UK, there might be this expectation that you have to be British, which is different. So I think maybe that's one difference between the US and UK, if we're just talking about what those differences are.
If I can just add, because I lived in the UK for 6 years, and I mean, I guess it's slightly different as well being from Canada than it is in the States. But I guess the sense that I got the whole time I was there, for some of my colleagues, they just, and I hadn't even considered myself, but they, after I don't know however many years, so it was less than 6 years, they already considered me a British Chinese artist, which I kind of thought, whoa, okay, that's nice. I hadn't thought about that. And then obviously, probably the majority of folks that I interacted with, I was just, either if they knew me, a Canadian living in Britain, or else just because I looked Asian, that I was a foreigner, which I was, being from Canada. And then I guess the experience, like sort of the microaggressions and kind of verbal attacks that I got there was just, I mean, I'm speaking from a personal experience, like it was very much like just walking down the streets in Montreal. It's just a daily or near daily experience. But I'm not sure if it's that useful to really compare the Canada, US, the UK, the how racist one country is or another. But definitely I agree that it's the sense that I got having lived in the UK, that it was very, colonial view and attitudes towards people of color.
Thanks, Karen. Next question. Historically and continuing to now, the onus is always on people of color to speak out against racism and resist racism. What can be done to further educate white communities on the problem of white supremacy, and to have those communities undertake more responsibility for the violence of racism? D? Mel? Anybody?
Well, I can say something. I think the first step may be practicing anti-racism on my own, to transform yourself every day. I think your amalgamation of events that create your personality and your makeup actually may lead you to places that need a reformation. So on a personal level, that is one thing. And therefore, and then when you can keep that evolution going, and also to have more criticality, to exercise more criticality, like even to take on delusions of this term democracy, I saw someone who said that white people should read more history. Well, we all need to read more history, and we all have to embrace a need to be, as Derrida talks about, justice even is not something that can be don't ever think it's something that can be apprehended or accomplished. That we have to look at the job description as a continual effort of critical engagement. So it's there's a lot to really do to really understand that it's a job description that's very real, and we all have to take it on, but we have to take it on individually to start with.
Not an answer, but I guess another question is what can we do when the other person doesn't want to be educated? Like, what can we do, or what can be done? Sorry, what can be done so that they want to educate themselves, that they want to do to support and all that. Just this question to throw out.
It's a good one. Yeah. That's a good art project. That's a hell of an art project. We got to take that on. You got. I don't think it's not. Also, it's an end game. What you're saying. How do you create? Make somebody. You don't make. You create a condition. What is the condition that we
desire? A desire in them to want.
You have to desire to reanimate curiosity, to reanimate things. I think that's the job description. It's not. Sometimes it's not the end that you get to, but the condition that you can create. And the definition of art is more. Maybe it's an option that you can create rather than one final direction, because I think as artistic practice is to open the game, not to close it, not to win it. It's to get rid of the winning because you ultimately end up a loser, Anyway, don't let me ramble. Onward.
Okay, I think we have room for one more question, and I'm sorry for all those people whose questions we didn't get to. Feel free to contact us at our email and on our website. We'd be happy to try to answer some of these questions for you. But our last question is, how do we stop racism and homophobia within our own Asian communities so we can truly stand together as one large allied group? For example, very conservative and traditional Asian parents from the baby boomer generation. Ouch. Teresa?
Yeah, it's not an easy question. I think about the community that I represent, which is very diverse in terms of having quite a few new immigrants and then their children who were American born, and then it's surrounded by various communities on all sides, so it's in the middle of a very diverse part of the city of Chicago, and issues of race and racism come up all the time, and sometimes it's a real challenge to get all members of the community to come together and understand how to approach it in a way that's productive and unified, right? Because you get a lot of people who approach things in a counterproductive way, so it can be very frustrating. I think that making sure more people understand Asian American history and how racism against Asian Americans is as we said before, completely intertwined in American history and is part of this racial structural inequality that we all live in, right? So, racism is, it's something that we all have to deal with. I mean, it's just so complicated. I'm not really sure, if what I'm saying is really answering the question for the person who asked it, but it's a very real issue. And I think that, sometimes there's a disconnect. There are quite a few, more affluent, professional Chinese immigrants that come in and tend to take a very conservative approach and can be very anti-Black and racist in their outlook, because they tend to want to align themselves with the white majority and don't understand the problem of model minority ideology and or the fact that our race can't be erased just because of achievements in a certain socioeconomic status. Like, it doesn't go away. You're still going to be Asian, and historically our communities have benefited from the civil rights movement and should be really involved in dismantling racism and being anti-racist. But it's something I still struggle with because not all members of the community are on the same page. So yeah.
I'd like to add to that, if I may, just really quickly, that I guess for myself, like, whenever people who I'm around have expressed sort of racism towards other communities around me, and I do make a point of calling them out on it, and then if I can. And I've also brought in sort of, not alternative, but sort of if they're getting all their news from these really problematic sources, of negative portrayals and such, and kind of perpetuating those kind of certain stereotypes, and I kind of try to counter that with more kind of other stories of other news sources that are more reliable in a way. And I think that's what that's what needs to be done sort of around this pandemic, where there are very problematic say negative portrayals and media, like misleading reports and sound bites in the media, which I just wonder if one can use those same channels, and by augmenting like our stories and sort of documents and kind of showing, I don't know, positive portrayals in a way that can help a little bit with that.
Anyone else?
I'm a boomer, so I gotta be quiet. It's my fault. It's our generation's fault. But I think the word positive, I think realistic portrayal. You have to convey your humanity. And if you convey you might have a better chance.
Yeah.
I think you fall into it always has to be, no, it's not always nice.
No.
It can be aggressive and show reality, because that's
right, that, yeah.
It's so that's an obligation to present ourselves,
And as we present ourselves, sorry, you go ahead, Mel.
No, yeah, well, that's basically it. Because, we talk about the media and all this, then we have to go another route. You fall into the mainstream, perhaps, or the expectations of capitalism, maybe. Let's say that. with expectation of the support structure. And maybe that's not all you have to do. So anyway.
I mean, what you're saying really resonates in terms of this realistic portrayal, because when we think about how skin lightening cream is booming globally, you know, when I was in Congo last year, it was the first billboard that I saw. And I know that this is also very prevalent in certain Asian communities too. So there keeps on being this alignment, right, with whiteness. And so I think, yes, it's about, you know, public portrayal and representation, absolutely. But to Mel's point, I think it's also self-representation too. And I don't think it's only the boomers, right? But this kind of, the aesthetics of whiteness, I think are really pervasive, and we should be aware of that. And sometimes it's so insidious, we don't even know that it's happening, right? Until we really pay attention and look at how bias and racism and self-hatred is infiltrating in our communities. And yeah.
Well, thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you to all of the panelists, and thank you to all the attendees. And I especially want to thank Liz Sung and Rubita Huang for producing this whole wonderful webinar for us. And we're going to be sharing the poll results, and just so everybody knows that Soup Dumplings won. And feel free, everybody, to reach out to us. We are on Facebook, we have a website, I'm on every social media site you can think of, and please reach out and let us know if you have more questions. Let us know how we can do better, and if we could do more of these, or if you have any art projects that we can help sponsor, please reach out. And you will be directed to a survey after this, and we really appreciate it if you can fill out the survey for us. It would help us improve our programming. And I think that is it for today. Thank you, everybody, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you. It's good to see y'all.
You too. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Take care now. See you in Miami, Dejha.
Yes, can't wait soon.
Big love, little Haiti.
Right on. Bye, Mel.
See ya.